Marcelina thought she finally found it. The love that didn't ask for anything in return. His name was Arthur, her boyfriend, a man in his early 30s who moved through the world like someone who had already decided he was the most generous person in the room. And for a long time, she believed he was. He remembered that she didn't like cilantro. He picked up her prescriptions without being asked. He showed up to her work event with a bouquet because, he said, he just wanted her to feel special. And she did feel special. That's the thing. In the beginning, Marcelina felt like the most cared-for person alive. He had this way of saying, "I just want to make you happy," that sounded like a vow. And the way his friends talked about him, he was the one who always picked up the tab, the one who drove people home, the one who showed up with groceries when you were sick. Everyone said the same thing. Arthur is the most selfless person I know. Marcelina had no reason to question it. She was in love. She was grateful. And gratitude, it turns out, can be shaped into almost any kind of container. It started small enough that she almost missed it. 3 months in, she canceled plans to see her college friend, someone she hadn't seen in over a year. She'd miscalculated. She and Arthur had already talked about spending that Saturday together. When she told him she'd made other plans first, he went quiet. Not angry, not loud, just quiet. He said it was fine. He said she should go. But by the end of the conversation, Marcelina had somehow ended up apologizing. She still isn't sure exactly how, and canceling with her friend instead. She told herself she'd chosen this, that nobody made her do anything, that Arthur hadn't even asked her to stay, not really. And that was true. He hadn't asked. But the weight of what he hadn't said sat in the room like a third person, and Marcelina had learned, without anyone teaching her, that keeping the peace was easier than carrying that weight. A few weeks later, she mentioned she was thinking about picking up a pottery class on Tuesday evenings. He smiled and said, "You should do whatever makes you happy." Then, quieter, "I just figured Tuesdays were our nights." She didn't sign up for the class. Here's what the world saw. A man who would do anything for the woman he loved. He cooked. He cleaned. He planned their trips. He sent flowers to her office just because. His family adored him. Her friends adored him. Her own mother, once pulled her aside and said, "Marcelina, this one actually takes care of you. Don't mess that up." And here's what Marcelina was living. A slow, creeping sensation that she owed him something she could never quite pay back. She couldn't name it then. It didn't have a shape yet. It just felt like she was always a little behind, like no matter what she gave, she was still somehow in debt. He never said she owed him. He never would. But every gesture came with a kind of memory. A ledger she hadn't agreed to keep, but found herself keeping anyway. When she wanted to spend a weekend visiting her sister 2 states away, he brought up the trip he'd surprised her with last spring. "I just sacrificed a lot to give you that," he said, and his voice was gentle, confused, like he couldn't understand why she'd want time away after everything. She went to see her sister, but she spent the whole drive there composing apology texts in her head. When she got a promotion and her team took her out for drinks afterward, she came home to a dinner he'd cooked, special, elaborate. And the way he looked at her when she walked in 90 minutes later than she'd said made the celebration evaporate from her body before she'd even set down her bag. "I'm not mad," he said. "I just spent all afternoon on this." She ate the meal. She thanked him. She felt guilty for having had fun. That word, guilty, started appearing in spaces where it had no business being. She felt guilty for calling her friend instead of him. Guilty for wanting a night alone. Guilty for not being more enthusiastic when he planned things. Guilty, almost, for having needs that weren't about him. And the quietest, most corrosive part, Marcelina started wondering if she was the problem. If maybe she was selfish. If maybe she took more than she gave. She was a person who had always tried to be fair. The accusation fit, because it didn't come from the outside. It came from inside her own head, in her own voice. That's how good the ledger was. She hadn't realized she was the one keeping it. One night, after a small disagreement about her spending a Saturday helping a coworker move, he said something she still remembers exactly the way he said it. "I just feel like nothing I do is ever enough for you." She hadn't said that. She'd never said that. But the sentence rearranged itself inside her, and by morning she was apologizing for making him feel that way, as if the problem were her ingratitude, and not whatever was actually happening. This is what made it so hard to see. He was never cruel. He was never loud. He never demanded. He gave. He gave and gave and gave, and the giving became the pressure itself. Beneath all of it, Marcelina would catch glimpses of something she didn't yet have language for. A man who needed, desperately, to be the most important thing in her world. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. The generosity wasn't fake, but it wasn't free either. It was armor. It was the way he made himself indispensable because indispensable felt safer than just being loved. And when Marcelina's world had people and ambitions and joys that weren't about him, that armor cracked, and the silence, the quiet dinner, the "I just" sentences, those were the sounds of that cracking. He wasn't a monster. He was someone so terrified of being left that he'd built a cage out of favors and called it love. There is a name for this. Psychologists who study relational control call it coercive debt, and not the kind with numbers. This is the kind built out of gifts and sacrifices and gestures that are real, genuinely given, but quietly coded with an invisible expectation. I did this for you, so now you owe me your time, your presence, your choices, your gratitude. The therapist and author Lundy Bancroft, who spent decades working with men who harm their partners, wrote that one of the most common tools of control isn't violence. It's the accumulation of obligation. The person being controlled often doesn't recognize it because it looks, from every angle, like love. In fact, it is love, tangled up with need and fear and the inability to let another person simply exist without orbiting around you. Bancroft called it the myth of the giving partner, the man who does everything so that questioning him feels like ingratitude, and leaving him feels like abandonment, and having a life of your own feels like betrayal. That's what made Marcelina's confusion so legitimate. She wasn't naive. She wasn't weak. She was inside a dynamic specifically designed to make its own mechanism invisible. The shift didn't come in a confrontation. It came on an ordinary afternoon. She was on the phone with her sister, laughing, really laughing, at a story her nephew had done something absurd, something involving a fire truck and a family of frogs, and her whole chest opened up with it. And then she heard the front door, and the laugh stopped, automatically, before she'd even processed that it had. She stood there in her own kitchen and felt the laughter go out of her like a light switching off. And then she felt herself listening for his footsteps, calibrating his mood from the sound of how he set down his keys. She was managing him. She had been managing him for a year, and she hadn't even known. She finished the call. She made sure her voice was bright and easy when she said goodbye to her sister. She looked at the wall for a moment. And she understood, slowly, like a fog that had been there so long she'd stopped seeing it, that she had spent 12 months slowly making herself smaller, quieter, less. Not because anyone told her to, because the cost of being fully herself had somehow become too high, and she'd been paying it without ever agreeing to the price. That was the thing she'd never had language for before. It wasn't that he'd taken anything from her. It was that she'd started leaving pieces of herself by the door. The laughter, the Tuesday pottery class, the Saturday with her sister.
and calling it love. That's not love. That's debt. Marcelina thought about the flowers he'd brought to her office. She thought about the elaborate dinner,